I've asked you to explain something of the inner workings of your model. And for anybody who doesn't know, Christian's been around for a huge amount of time, back into the last century and back further back. So you have spent more than 4 decades dealing with people who've joined extreme authoritarian sects. Is that the right expression?
That's close enough.
And so in that time, I mean, you've dealt with thousands of people over the years, and you've developed a way of looking at that. It's a way of looking at that involvement and untangling the involvement that people have.
The reason for the model is because I wanted to get away from the word cults. And I wanted to find a way of describing the problem in terms of the problem itself rather than a label for it.
Yes.
So whether we think that the word cult is useful or not, the one thing it doesn't do is describe. And so I still get calls saying, is such and such group a cult like so and so?
Yes, I've had many years of saying to people, is it harming anybody? That we're not concerned about how to label it. Is it doing damage?
And on the other hand, then there is the battle between different sides of the issue over whether you should call it something else, like a new religious movement. And you and I have, over the years, have had many conversations about what a useless term new religious movements can be. And on the other hand, there are people who say, well, if you don't call them a cult, then you're not militant enough against them. And who wants to get involved in that kind of an argument? If you use the word cult, you're too militant. If you don't use it, you're not militant enough. You don't have the right point of view. And I just wanted to completely clear the deck and start fresh. So I started fresh with, what are the things that I see happening that are destructive? And I boiled it down over some years to extremism, authoritarianism, and sectarianism. Now, I did try to think of different ways of, different synonyms for this and different ways of arranging it. And finally I said, it doesn't matter, because the only person who's going to talk about this is me. So, I know what I mean. And I just left it at that. I suppose I could have turned it around to C, and then we have, connections to Sea Org, and they deserve it, but that's beside the point. It's another battle I didn't want. So I wanted to talk about extremism, authoritarianism, and sectarianism, and I wanted to talk about their opposites, complexity or diversity. And I wanted to talk about cooperative, what I now call cooperative interdependence. I used to call it self-determination, but I realized there's actually a step beyond that. And I've come to call it cooperative interdependence, or just interdependence for short. And then on the other side of sectarianism is the openness to have dialogue with anybody. The promise of communication, that you can talk to anyone about anything. I think that would be a good thing if Scientologists could do it. It would be a good thing if any abusive group could do it.
Talk freely to anyone on any subject. Sorry, I'm talking over you, which is not.
That's all right.
Which is meant to
usually do this.
Which is meant to be the beginning point of Scientology, the communication release, and unfortunately, it isn't. So, and we should be able to.
It is in fact the opposite.
Yeah, one of the things that's bothered me in the last year or so is seeing protesters in the United States on opposite sides standing within a few feet of each other with megaphones and shouting obscenities at each other, and it's really not the place where anything will ever be resolved.
Exactly. So for me, what I was interested in was looking at these three qualities, because these three characteristics, these three ways of looking at how a group functions, or how any kind of a leadership relationship functions, it seems to me that that's where all the destruction takes place. So since that time, over these years, I've done things like looked at this from the standpoint of how do cognitive dysfunctions and distortions operate within the model, and how does Lifton's 8 points, his set of 8 points, how does that set of 8 points operate within the model? And I see a very close coordination of those things. And the thing I like about it is that when I explain it, whether I'm talking to an ex-member or I'm talking to someone who's not sure they want to leave yet, they just want someone to talk to and ask, you know, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? It's not an attack. It's simply an observation. Here are some things that I've observed over the years can be harmful to people. Here are some things that I've observed over the years make people's life difficult, both in the group that they've joined and in the family that they so often leave behind.
Yeah.
And in their everyday life, their careers or whatever they're, you know, whatever they're pursuing, their studies and so on. And it makes it easier to talk about the actual harm and introduce the concept of harm, not in terms of it's either good for you or it's bad for you, but on a series of scales. And that's why I've come up with this, because anybody who's done a bit of geometry will recognize that this is an x-axis, a y-axis, and a z-axis, or if you're in America, a z-axis.
A three-dimensional form.
It's a three-dimensional form. And, you know, so, for example, you take that first straight line back here, this one here, of extremism versus complexity. That doesn't have to be, you're either in this camp or you're in this camp. So at the kind of the 0 point, you have the transition. Are you going to separate yourself by looking at other people and saying, those people, they're not with us, therefore, we're the only right ones. We are the only ones who see it right. And falling into binary thinking, black and white thinking, and then dividing everything down. So I don't believe in leaving Europe, therefore I'm a bad person, or I do believe in leaving Europe, therefore I'm a bad person. That kind of simplicity that says this one single thing paints the whole person and paints the whole movement. And in with that is this idea of questioning. The most important, for me, the most important thing is what happens when a person asks questions. So if I'm in a healthy group, I can, you know, I can have a teacher or a leader or whatever he's or she's supposed to be, say something, and I can say, excuse me, that doesn't sound quite right. Could you explain that? Or excuse me, I read such and such and so, and it seems to contradict that. Can you explain the contradiction or help me to understand what's going on here? And we can have a conversation. But when it tips over into the negative, you get this kind of formulaic approach to questions. So it's a question means you have a doubt. And a doubt isn't an innocent thing. A doubt is the same thing as unbelief. And of course, unbelief is rebellion and sin and evil. So you've got this collapsing down of anything short of utter surrender to an idea, utter agreement with an idea. And you take those things and you collapse them down. Questions are good for us, especially when we're asking questions about the things that we think we're most sure of. You know, I'm absolutely sure that Euclid was right, except if you try to do Euclidean geometry on a sphere, it starts to break down. And the smaller the sphere, the more obvious it is it breaks down. That's good. Now, if I say that to my teacher, he can come back at me and say, now we're ready to talk about non-Euclidean geometry. Now we're ready to stretch out into other forms of mathematics. You're ready to take the next step forward because actually what you just said is right. But it starts out, or it has in the past started out, even in younger grades, a child will have heard that you can subtract the big number from a little number. And there's something called the negative side of the number line. And all of a sudden that child's in trouble because the teacher didn't think that was supposed to be talked about in class yet. No, we're not doing that now. So you're wrong for saying that too soon. Whatever the age, whatever the subject, however much the complexity is, the ability to ask the question without it being labeled a bad way of thinking is really important.
So is it extremist? Everything is oversimplified.
Absolutely. That's the black and whiteness. That's the binary thinking, which in psychological terms is a cognitive dysfunction. If you can't allow yourself to see, well, maybe even though he's wrong in a lot of things, maybe he's got a point, and I need to learn that, and I need to understand him. This thing that this person's saying, I don't quite agree with it, and it's okay that I don't agree with it. That kind of flexibility is taken away, and the mind becomes more and more inflexible. So if you're talking about right here near the 0 point, extremism, to use Lifton, might dispense existence metaphorically. Well, these people aren't as good as we are. They're not proper. They're not proper Muslims or proper Jews or proper Christians or proper Buddhists or whatever. They're not proper Scientologists. They're squirrels. Whatever. They're not proper. They're not proper Republicans. They're Republicans in name only. They're rhinos. This idea that, figuratively speaking, we withdraw their right to exist. They're a lower level. As that progresses down and we become more extreme, that becomes less of a metaphor until we are shipping them off to concentration camps, to death camps, and putting them in gas chambers.
The Rohingya in up there in Myanmar.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, building a gallows outside the Capitol building and saying that we should hang someone. That's already a movement away from the metaphor.
Yeah.
How literal it would have turned out to be if they had the opportunity, we'll never know, but they were moving away from the metaphor. And so these things, they become more literal to the point where one day someone will have to decide who gets to live and who doesn't. And when that happens, we're supposed to be the people in charge. And we're supposed to decide who lives and who dies. So that's extremism. And that means we can measure extremism. We can actually sit down with, I don't know, maybe somebody could sit down and create a questionnaire that would examine this. I think some people have already done that in terms of extremism where it applies to terrorism. But the same kind of approach could be taken to this, to say, this group, if you leave their group, you're dead to them. They won't talk to you in the street. They won't acknowledge you. They might send you a letter saying you're not allowed to communicate with anyone. But are they going to come and shoot you? Are they going to kidnap you and make you disappear? Are you going to be found 6 months from now, your remains floating in a river someplace? Or are they just saying, well, as far as we're concerned, you're dead to us?
Yeah.
That measures on this chart here. That measures. And you could, through questioning, which addresses not just what members are saying and ex-members are saying, but which looks at policy, you could look at that and say, we now have an idea. This group is more extreme than that group. That group is more extreme than the other group. On the other hand, you have this idea of inclusiveness, of openness to outsiders. The question that is seen as a doorway into knowledge, a doorway into reality. I asked the question, and now I have to reevaluate things that I've thought. I have to deconstruct some things maybe. And that's a good thing. That means that now I'm allowed to doubt. I'm allowed to be curious. I'm allowed to pursue. I'm allowed to talk to people who disagree and who are going to attack what I've said or what I've thought and are going to challenge me and make me think. And I'm going to do the same with them. We're going to be open to one another. And so the opposite for me of extremism is this embracing of complexity.
Yeah.
Life doesn't have to be boiled down to a 1 or a 0.
Would this be the term pluralism?
It could be pluralism. It can certainly include pluralism, although I tend to put that more when I'm talking about sectarianism versus dialogue.
Okay.
But those two categories, as the years have gone on, I've realized that those two categories, they overlap a lot. They interact a lot because they're both empowered by the same thing, which is authority, and the abuse of authority. Because the primary point of authority is I have to have power and I have to retain it and I have to extend it. And so these things do cross over. But this, I see extremism as ultimately about my individual psychology and how, as that individual, I interact with the rest of the group and the rest of the world. Whereas in sectarianism, it's about adopting, for me at least, as I'm using it, it's about adopting a group identity and restricting myself within that group identity. But we'll come to that.
Yeah.
Does that make sense out of extremism for you?
Yeah, I'm still looking at, if there's a spectrum with extremism at one end, I'm not sure that I'm perfectly happy with the term complexity at the other end.
I'm not happy with it either. I haven't been happy with it for years, but I'm trying to capture something that I don't know a better word for yet.
Well,
if you do, give it to me.
Well, and here we are. People will watch this, and hopefully there's somebody out there who will give us a better word. And it is, I think it's something that's very important in this field at the moment, to make sure that our definitions are good, because you can't have a good discussion without some agreement about what the terms mean. And in this case, we've become bogged down. The term cult exemplifies this, and how reluctant I was to abandon the term, because it doesn't have a pejorative meaning in its origin. That's very much a 20th century thing. The idea that there's something bad in being devoted to a leader or devoted to an ideology, which is what a cult was. But I let go of it in the end, because, as you say, there are people have a set view of what it means. I don't tend to use the word hypnosis, because everybody knows what it means.
Exactly.
That means you can't actually talk about what it really is.
Exactly.
So it's best to talk about guided imagination rather than hypnosis, which people can deal with more readily.
And this is exactly the point here. And I think the reason I fell on complexity eventually was because I wanted to talk in terms of how we respond to ideas and beliefs rather than how we respond directly to other people. The idea that I was aiming for here was that my ideas either are closed ideas in sectarianism and in extremism, or they're open ideas, which means they can be challenged, which means I can challenge them or other people can challenge them, which means I can decide maybe X country isn't the best country in the whole wide world. Maybe they have flaws. I can decide that maybe my way of licking a postage stamp isn't the best way. It doesn't matter whether it's a small idea or a big idea. The idea is that I accept, if I have found the right way to do it for me, then I'm happy with doing it that way. That doesn't imply that nobody else knows how to do it. I have certain ways I make coffee. Let's use something nice and innocent like that. I have certain ways I like to make coffee. I like the method. I like the ritual of it, if you like, and I like the results. I like to drink it. Some people I make coffee for seem to like the way I make coffee. But I know there are people out there who make coffee at least as good as I do. And some people who I know make better coffee than I do, and they do it completely differently. And I'm happy in the realms of complexity to say there is more than one way to make a really, really good cup of coffee. And as long as I like what I drink and live with what I drink and it's okay, then I don't have to worry about converting everybody to my way of making coffee. You have to use this much coffee and that much water and time it for exactly that. And that's what I do. You've seen me make coffee.
6 degrees.
You have seen me make coffee, and I can be a little bit obsessive about it. But my obsession doesn't mean I'm right. And so that's what I mean by complexity. It's more focused on that.
It gives us the extremist end. We have fixed ideas.
Yes.
At the end, the complexity end of the spectrum, we have flexibility. And it brings to mind Isaiah Berlin's statement that the only thing we need to be intolerant of is intolerance.
Which is great fun.
Yeah, he was a good old laugh. What can I say? It is very important that sometimes there is a way of doing something. If we look to science, there is a way of extracting hydrogen and oxygen from water. And there may be different approaches, and it's a matter of whether you get coffee at the end of the process or not. But if you have a preference, and our individuality is so much determined by this, by the capacity to say, this is what I like. That individual preference is a real indicator of whether somebody is extremist or not. And again, this takes us into Lifton's doctrine over person or ideology over experience,
Yes.
where you're
Yes.
accepting something because somebody else says it's right, even when it goes against your own experience. And that we're definitely, you know, in the territory of extremism there.
Exactly. And this is one of the things that I've done over the years, is to look at how Lifton feeds into the different parts of this model. That, you know, he's talking about things which create the excesses and abuses that I've got on this model. And he's talking about the way that we surrender to certain characteristic ways of thinking or not thinking that make us vulnerable to ending up down at this negative end here instead of up there.
Yeah.
So that for me is what I'm talking about by extremism. That surrender of the acceptance that I might not be the only right guy in the room, and I'm not the smartest guy in the room, and I should just get on with saying, yeah, but I like honey and banana and wheat germ sandwiches. What's the problem?
That is
yes,
a problem.
Okay. You know, yes, I have enjoyed putting ketchup on vanilla ice cream. What's your problem? I'm not serving it to you. I'm eating it myself. If you don't like it, don't have any. So does that make extremism make sense?
Yeah, and we could plot something. We could take something like homophobia, and at the extreme end, we'd have ISIS, who basically, if they found somebody was gay, would throw them from the top of a high building. And so that is, you know, we are terminating resistance.
That's right off the far end. Yeah.
If we come a little bit in from that, we get Alexander Dugin, the guru of Russia's peculiar behavior at the moment. And he will just say, well, and this is an attitude I met when I was in Russia, homosexuality is wrong and you should go to prison for it. And then you come down the scale until you actually pass that 0 point and say, it's not really.
Well, then there was what's her name Baptists, the crazy people that demonstrated, and you know, God hates gays and all that kind of thing.
The Westboro,
that's the name. Yeah.
It's become a very moot point, hasn't it? That what we should tolerate, what people should be allowed to do with their own bodies and their own minds, is we have so much that's built around that, and our own systems have been most definitely extremist in the past.
Yeah.
Homosexuality is a capital offence in the British Navy, for example, in the Royal Navy.
Right. Well, this also contributes to the idea that individual personal preference and taste is not a sign of anything except your individuality. It's not a sign that there's something wrong with you. I remember back in the 1970s, I think it was, being at a meeting where a group of people were being told that only evil people wear brown shoes or brown socks.
Oh, that is true.
And it wasn't so long ago that there were people in the Jesus Army who were being told at one point that having your toast too dark was evil. And, you know, just all these kinds of weird things. I don't think that one lasted very long, but, and of course he's dead now, so they don't have to worry about burning their toast anymore and having dark toast. But those kinds of little oddities of saying your taste can be wrong, your preference can be wrong, you're liking a certain thing or disliking a certain thing. You know, whether it's as extreme as, well, all of this kind of music is of the devil, or it's just, well, wearing a certain color or liking a certain style or wearing your hair a certain way or writing with a certain kind of pencil. I kid you not.
And there are many prohibitions. As you say, in music, you had the devil's chord.
Yeah.
For many years you couldn't use. In Norway, the hardanger fiddle, which has sympathetic strings and a very fascinating sound. It sounds like an Indian instrument. You couldn't take it into a church.
Right.
because it was the devil's instrument.
Mm.
And I see these prejudices. We still have laws that are to do with personal preference. So most of all, we could say the drug laws, which all originated in racism. The Chinese Exclusion Act in, I think, 1882, that began the war on drugs, what Nixon would eventually call the war on drugs. So, you know, extreme views can be very variable, and have.
I think the worst part of all of that is that they shut down the research prematurely.
I mean, we've seen the same with American presidents stopping the publication of work on climate change, because it went against a belief. And extremism always has a belief involved in it. There's, you know, to be righteous, to be good, to be saintly, to get to heaven, to reincarnate, to become one of Krishna's shepherdesses, you have to do these things.
Yeah, it's a demand for purity.
A demand for purity, again, in the
we could spend the entire night here just picking off Lifton off this.
Yeah,
because although he didn't attempt to systematize it, because he was talking about a different way that these 8 principles were being applied, with much less finesse, it has to be said. But the essence of it is all there. He hit those 8 spots, and he was right about them. Yeah. So anyway, that's extremism. As I've tried to. Now, in the actual process of working with people who are coming out of their group, or who have come out of their group, this goes along with another model that you know about, in terms of how internal reality is constructed through the indoctrination process, through what I've called destructive manipulation at times. This creation of an internal reality which isn't the same as the world outside, and which is mastered by the leader. And in the most extreme forms, it takes the form of internalizing the leader, so that the person is second guessing what the leader would say. If I did this, the leader would do this to me and would tell me that. And it becomes very invasive in the most extreme cases, where the person leaves the group and years later, they still have the voice of the leader in their head, condemning certain actions, forbidding certain actions, frightening them, punishing them psychologically in his absence, or even after his death, because they have surrendered. And I came across a quote just recently that I'd forgotten all about in Lifton. And I was reading it to somebody who didn't have a copy of the book, and I suddenly came across this. And to read this, I actually need 2 pairs of glasses. Yes. And this is under mystical manipulation, which is a very important thing as well.
Yes.
Let's start here. The individual then responds to the manipulations through developing what I shall call the psychology of the pawn, feeling himself unable to escape from forces more powerful than himself. He subordinates everything to adapting himself to them. He becomes sensitive to all kinds of cues, expert at anticipating environmental pressures, and skillful in riding them in such a way that his psychological energies merge with the tide rather than turn painfully against himself. This requires that he participate actively in the manipulation of others, as well as in the endless round of betrayals and self-betrayals which are required. That's the last but one paragraph on mystical manipulation, which is on page 423 of this old version of the book.
Yes, in terms of obedience to the guru's intention, you and I are both aware that the New Kadampa tradition will actually, and there may be other Tibetan Bonpo traditions that are similar, that where you are visualizing the guru, so the guru is actually physically present with you at all times.
Yes.
And that is an absolutely mind-breaking reality. You've now got this person in your head in the room. And it's an important thing about, I think internal reality is something that we have to pause and think about. I've read that Immanuel Kant was put forward the view that there is the world outside and there is the world inside, and the world inside is an interpretation of the world outside.
Yeah.
So Ron
And
Hubbard,
this has now been confirmed through a lot of the experiments done by neuroscientists now, where you know, it starts with something as simple as looking at a batter in baseball or in cricket and realizing there is no possible way that he could react to the pitcher or the bowler fast enough. He's got to predict, because if he waits till the ball's halfway to him to react to it, that's when he swings and misses. And from there, you just go to more and more elaborate things where, in fact, the brain is a prediction machine, and the brain is figuring out what's supposed to happen next and what's supposed to be there, and that's how we survive. The thing is, if we grow normally, if we mature normally, that prediction and the internal map that the prediction creates for us more or less corresponds to reality out there, so that we safely navigate it. The problem comes when someone comes and interferes with it to the point where all of our reality is filtered through them, through the leader, and the leader then determines what reality is. So the leader tells us that we're really operating thetans from bazillions of years ago, and you know, and
tells us that the psychiatrists have always been they're trying to destroy all of life, all of humanity, for reasons we don't quite understand. And to do this, they're using rose perfume. And so, it's a curious one in Scientology, because if you're a public Scientologist, paying public as they're also known, as I was, you see nothing at all about this. But as you got closer to Hubbard, you'd find that he had his laundry rinsed in plain water 13, 15, even 17 times, depending on where this was happening, because he had an absolute abject paranoia about scent. And you find that in the training of C organization members, you have what's called the hygiene hat, and it tells them they may not use perfume of any kind. They may not use any perfumed products, including soaps, shampoos, or laundry or fabric conditioners. And this is because he had this notion that there was some kind of crazy brainwashing, and I know of no explanation of this on his part, only that his sensitivity, his hypersensitivity to odors, is mirrored in Rajneesh.
I was just going to say, we see that again in Rajneesh. We don't see any micromanaged explanation of what to do about it. Simply, if you can't get past the two people at the door sniffing you from head to toe, you're not going to get to sit and listen to me not say anything. The interesting thing to me is that whether it's some hyper-explained thing about scent and contamination and his paranoia, or whether it's this mysterious thing that the guru is so spiritual, so ethereal, that he has to be protected from the invasiveness of the material world.
Yes.
And, you know, as interpreted by the people who might or might not like you, who are at the door today. Whichever way it is, it acts as a powerful control of your behavior. It acts to create anxiety that you might not be up to scratch today, and that means that you are in trouble, or at least you're missing out on the presence. And it acts to motivate you positively, to absolutely make sure in Scientology, you make sure you rinse and ultra rinse after not using contaminated products in the first place. You rinse and rinse and rinse. But then in Rajneesh, they had their whole line, their whole toiletries line, and their laundry line, and all sorts of things that they sold to make sure that you were absolutely scent free. Until, of course, the person at the door didn't like you, and then it didn't matter what products you bought or how much you were ripped off for them. You were done. You know, you're not getting into that. So the control mechanism from that, whatever the excuse for it, is so powerful that people find themselves doing exactly as Lifton described, predicting what problem am I likely to experience if I don't toe the line about this subject or about that subject. So I'm not going to have an opinion about rose-scented toiletries. That's a stupid opinion for me to have. I'm going to do what I'm told. I'm not going to use non-Rajneesh shampoo. That's a stupid thing to do. And so now I'm being
I'm not going to
conformed.
sniff roses, just in case.
Just in case, yes. And the scent might linger on the hairs of my nose.
And turn me into a psychiatrist.
But it's an interesting thing that these little foibles about the leaders, about the gurus and masters and what have you, they become control mechanisms. And they become ways that the followers have to internalize the leader in order to survive the possible danger. They find themselves guessing, oh, well, he once said to somebody that, I don't know, science fiction films were stupid. I've just decided I don't like science fiction films anymore. Or he's just decided, he once said that Star Trek was about reality. Well, I better really get into Star Trek, hadn't I? Doesn't matter which way that goes, the person knows he's got to conform, and he begins to predict how to do that in the best way possible. And this is bringing us straight into the whole thing about authoritarianism. Because as you said, there can be, in certain ways, there is a right way and a wrong way to do something. You know, on the simplest level, back in the days when you could work on your own automobile without destroying it, because you didn't need a computer back then, there is a right way to take out a spark plug, and there's a right way to gap it, and there's a right way to put it back in and reconnect everything. And there are some wrong ways, and your car won't like the wrong ways. So yes, it's good to talk to an experienced mechanic and pay attention and do what you're told. That's sensible. So I would put that at the top of this line here and say this is about cooperative interdependence, or at the very least, it's about self-determination. Yeah, this guy seems to know how to make a car work.
I mean, you're dealing there with expert authority.
Exactly.
Where somebody is, the plumber, the surgeon, the electrician, whoever, they understand the topic and they can work with it. Then, of course, we have rank authority, which pretends expertise.
Yes.
And
you salute the uniform, you salute the rank, you don't salute the man, sort of thing. Yeah,
absolutely. And that gives us authoritarianism, where somebody has become an authority, that what they say. So, with Ron Hubbard, one of my favorites is how to put flowers in a vase, or vase if you prefer. And it's got this little thing about not hitting the vase against the faucet. Now, vase, I understood, vase. Faucet, never heard the word before in my life, so we had to look that one up. The tap. So you're being warned by this incredible guru that he's worked out that you mustn't break the vase before putting the flowers in. And it really, I'm sure it's an aspect of his condition, and I'm pretty confident that Yuval Lao's estimation that Ron Hubbard had temporal lobe epilepsy is correct. Yeah. And part of that is this micro-control, where he has to be the authority on everything. There's another policy on how to clean windows.
I was going to say, that's the one I've heard so many times. Yeah, but he was right about the right way to clean windows.
Authority and being authoritarian, so that you and I have both settled on this idea of authoritarianism, which at its extreme is totalitarianism, a portmanteau word, first used of Mussolini, I believe, to say total authoritarianism. So you don't get to make any decisions. You don't get to be a grown-up in any situation. Exactly. Here are the rules. You're an infant. You've got to do as you're told. Yeah. And within these systems, as within Scientology, the only person who could actually discover anything new about the universe was Ron Hubbard.
Exactly.
It will never be that perceptive, no matter how much money you spend.
And that is the key there, that this idea that ultimately the leader acts as a filter. And this can be done in a soft way, or it can be done in a hard way, but it comes up again and again. So when I was growing up, I had a friend whose parents were in a particular group where one of the local leaders would come to their house every few weeks and inspect all the reading material in their house, question them about which shows they watched on TV, how much TV they watched, question them about what they listened to on the radio, examine their record collection, physically took books off their bookshelf if he didn't like them. The Reader's Digest, by the way, was not a good read for him. I mean, I don't particularly care for it for other reasons, but it wasn't, you know, I don't see anything wrong with it. But apparently this leader would come around and confiscate the Reader's Digest, would confiscate other magazines. And then at the end of it all, he would sit down with them and question them closely about their sexual relationship. And he did this over and over again every few weeks. And my friend said, you know, because he wasn't a member, he would sit in his bedroom at the door listening to this and hearing all sorts of things that he wasn't expecting to hear. And it's thoroughly put him off joining the group. That's really extreme. On the other hand, you can have just, you know, an issue of these books aren't good for us to read. I mean, I remember back in the 50s, the Catholic Church in their newspapers or whatever these things were that they circulated, at the back page, there was a list of books that were rated according to how bad they were, right down to the books you mustn't read. And likewise, films were rated according to whether they were acceptable or not.
Which was certainly still running when The Exorcist came out, The Life of Brian. There were films.
The thing is, they didn't check up on you. They said, you know, these are the things we would like you to do, but they didn't check it. And I know plenty of my friends who you know, I'd be in the cinema because I had a job as a teenager in a cinema, and these Catholic friends of mine would show up, and they'd be laughing, you know, oh, look at that. The second movie is one we're not supposed to watch. This will be a hoot, you know. And it was like,
I'm told there are even Roman Catholics who use contraception, but
yeah.
maybe I'm misinformed.
I have had people tell me that their priest, when they asked him about contraception, said, what you do in your house, in your bedroom, is between you and God. It's none of my business. I don't want to know.
But God doesn't want you to do it.
But, you know, no, his attitude was nothing to do with me. And I think that was, at that point, that was, you know, this idea that we're not going to the point where we're going to stand over you and supervise your life and micromanage you. Whereas this other, you know, this friend of mine, his parents were being questioned about their sexual practices. We're talking about authoritarianism, where the leader takes to himself the right to determine how you see the world around you. And you are wrong to not agree. The idea of authoritarianism actually empowers everything else. That's the root that everything grows out of. So if you are not agreeing to take on his view of the world, you are kicked off into the punishment system of extremism.
Yeah.
You are going to be shut up and not allowed to eat with your family. Your meals are served separately in another room. You are not going to be allowed to leave the house, perhaps, for a long time. And eventually, you will be kicked out. You will be totally distanced from the group. No, you've become a non-person. No one is allowed to acknowledge your existence.
Persona non grata.
Yeah.
So it said that during the pandemic, which of course is still going on, in fact, but during the pandemic, David Miscavige, the commandant of Scientology, decided to go against the kind of QAnon sensibilities of most Scientologists and ordered vaccinations for staff members. And I am told that quite a lot of staff members refused vaccinations, believing that it would kill them, sterilize them, do whatever. And so they were put into isolation. So yeah, you'd be...
That'll teach them.
Yeah. And because in Scientology, this was the special technique that was devised to cure insanity.
Yeah.
And insanity might be defined as disagreement with Ron Hubbard. You know?
Right.
So the penalties become extreme for making decisions for yourself.
Oh yeah. Well, see, this again, part of the demand for purity. A truly pure person recognizes the leader as the only person to listen to.
Which, if the leader is perfect, might be all right.
Yeah.
But they aren't.
But they aren't, no.
They
They just don't manage that. And because of that, you have this idea that the sole source, well, you know, the sole source may say, I'm going to come and get the books off your bookshelf that don't belong there. Or he may say, you can't use the computer until you install this disk on your computer to help you to stay away from the bad things that you shouldn't be going to.
Yeah.
You know, some groups are told they're not allowed to have television sets, they're not allowed to have radios, they're not allowed to read newspapers. Sometimes this same thing is done by keeping you so busy, you don't have time for movies and television and radio and newspapers and what have you. Well, you know, you have to read this book, you have to study this, you're going to have an exam on this, you're going to have to answer for what this is. And maybe you're going to go through what's supposed to be a Bible study, except that there are questions at the bottom telling you exactly what you're supposed to think about it. And in fact, it's not a Bible study, it's somebody writing screeds of their interpretation, which comes from the Watchtower Society heads. And you're not really studying the Bible. What you're doing is you're studying somebody's filtered opinion. And so you get the filtering, and then you get the test to make sure that you've absorbed the filtering. And where's the time to do anything else when you're having to do this?
And then you have the, you know, the brainwashing of my dad scenario, a little documentary that's well worth watching, I think, where we find an elderly man who, having been a moderate, kindly and benevolent person all of his life, suddenly becomes vituperative and vehement and angry about things. And his daughter tracks this down to the sources of his information, that he is listening to right-wing radio shows, presenters like Rush Limbaugh, who make material up. You know, that is a part of the problem, the kind of Alex Jones set, that they just make things up. And so you can be caught up in, and it can happen at, you know, it doesn't belong to one side or another. If there are sides, there are extremists who will say, you should only read, you know, the Daily Worker, or you should only watch Fox News, and so that gatekeeping of information becomes extremely important as to what the internal reality of the person is, because they see no contradiction to their views, and they will reject any idea because it seems to come from the wrong place. And that is, and I see that politically happening wherever people are on the political spectrum. It is so easy to simply discount anything that disagrees with your idea, because we all have my side bias, confirmation bias.
Exactly.
And we need, you know, we need to be careful. I've said often that one of the things I enjoy is the cognitive dissonance I feel when somebody disagrees with me. If they disagree with me in a courteous fashion and they offer me evidence, then that I welcome that. But I do understand that as a younger person, it was confusing to me, and the thing to do was to argue against things that disagreed with my view, rather than sitting back and taking in whatever information they had to give and checking it, and then offering an opinion, you know, rather than simply batting it away. Unless, of course, the opinion being offered was ridiculous, you know, that all black people are evil, or white people are evil, or
Are you saying you don't believe that the earth is hollow with a whole civilization inside?
Of course it is. I think that's been proven long.
Okay, you're one of the good guys.
The sun's in the very middle.
You're one of the good guys then. I can keep talking to you. It's all right. We can keep talking. Yeah, and that is exactly the problem, because again, it's this thing, are you allowed to question? Are questions valid? Are challenges valid?
Yeah.
Are deconstructions valid? Are invitations to rethink a whole thing? You know, Einstein turned the world upside down just by disagreeing with Newton. And it wasn't a big disagreement, it was just a little thing, you know, but he turned the world upside down technologically. And that was not his intention. I don't think he actually cared about the technology. I think he was much more interested in the mathematics. Whatever idea you come up with, there's always somebody who has a commercial interest in stopping it. And that's just the nature of the world we've created around ourselves.
Yep.
But you know, over against authoritarianism, then we have this idea that you're allowed to do your own reality testing. So the leader says, blah, 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 blah. And you say, I'm going to check that. And you go off and you do your own research. And you say, he was right about this. He was wrong about that. He was sort of right about that. He's really got that completely wrong. And I don't know why he said this, because nobody knows the answer to this. And he was just pulling that out of thin air. And that's okay. In a non-authoritarian environment, I remember when I was in 6th grade, there was a young lad named George who knew an uncommon lot about history around the time of World War II. European history in the 20th century, he was phenomenal. And his knowledge actually went back into the previous century, which for a 6th grader is quite impressive. And at one point, our teacher made certain statement about something, and he was just glossing over the particular topic in passing to get to the point he was really trying to present to us. And George, boom, hand goes up, and the teacher calls on him, and George said what he had to say. And I'll never forget, this teacher is one of my first teaching heroes because his reaction was, George, I don't think I knew that until you said it just now. Next week, would you mind giving us a short paper on that subject? And I thought, what a teacher.
I had his antithesis as a history teacher. It was a man called Brooke. And I switched schools mid-curriculum. And so I hadn't been studying 20th century history, and I'm suddenly thrown into this thing. My way of dealing with that was to read the relevant chapter of the textbook the night before the lesson.
Right.
So that when Mr. Brooke made a mistake, I'd put my hand up and said, you know, I don't think that's so. And his response was to blurt out, well, if you're so clever, you teach the lesson. And I was about 15, probably. Yeah. And he went out of the classroom and left me to teach the lesson, which you know, only 10 minutes left. I'd read what it said in the textbook, saying, you know, he hadn't. And so I didn't have any difficulty in teaching the rest of the lesson. And a friend of mine walked past in the corridor and saw that he was by the door, red-faced and furious. Now, that is the authoritarian attitude. He came up to me, thankfully, after I'd taken the exam, and he said, if you've passed that exam, you're a genius. Now, I'd only done 2 of the 5 terms of study, and I did pass the exam. But I didn't get a little badge saying, John is a genius, you know, for that. Don't remember talking to him again.
I'm going to call him out. Mr. Davidovich was his name. And I was so impressed by his willingness to say, you know, you've got stuff that it's worth you saying it to us all, you know, put it together, give us a couple of pages worth that. Of course, George being George gave us about 4 pages before he was, you know, Mr. Davidovich explained, well, we don't actually need that much detail, but thank you. And, you know, but to acknowledge that this pupil had really gotten to something there. I thought, Mr. Davidovich, you are a prince, because it would have been so easy to just, you know, shut up and sit down, or any variation of that. And he didn't. It would have been so easy.
And that again is looking towards the type of society we would like to see, where we all accept we're part of a community of learning. Some of us perhaps with more information on certain topics than others. But it doesn't mean that, you know, it does happen that even children can have an insight. I think this week there's something in my feed that said a 17-year-old had worked out how to make electric motors without using rare earth ingredients, which is an incredible breakthrough. This just means so much. 17 years old, and I think it said he'd already got something like 50 patents worked out. And you go, well, this is a kid who's been in the right environment, you know, whereas, you know, certainly when I was at school, you know, for most of the teachers would have just shut you up. for having any kind of original thought. And this idea of conformity, of uniformity, of fitting in, of belonging, instead of doing something that is good for the collective, that is good for humanity, just, you know, minding your P's.
I think this is the thing, you know, authoritarianism isn't, the opposite of authoritarianism isn't anarchy or disregard. I think it has to include, yes, it includes experts, people who actually know what they're talking about. I don't need to get my history from yet another episode of Robin Hood on the television. I do need to get my history from people who know what actually happened in whatever time period I'm studying, and who can explain to me where to look to get more information if I need it. But this idea of a healthy contrariness, of encouraging healthy contrariness, a non-authoritarian person will encourage a healthy contrariness, not a in your eye, I'm going to disagree with you, but simply recognizing that people are going to grow beyond you, no matter how clever you are. And you have to embrace them growing beyond you. That's what you're there for.
Absolutely.
You are there to see people propelled beyond yourself. And to do that, then that makes people self-determining. And that then gives them the ability to become interdependent, not independent. I've been challenged on this again recently, why I talk about interdependence. And it's because A, we are social animals, but that's just a biological fact and a psychological fact. But B, because we learn who we are in our relationships. So in my relationships with other people, they show me things about myself I don't know. And in that, I also discover abilities that I have that I didn't know. I discover weak spots that I didn't know I had. And I do the same with them. And that interdependence makes everybody concerned stronger. And it makes us cooperative, and it builds society, but it makes each of us a stronger part of that society. So independence, yeah, if you want to be a monk and sit on a flagpole, or, you know, live in a cave, maybe that works for you, but it's not true, because you're still getting the food you need and the clothing you need. You got it from somewhere.
And if you're a stylite sitting up on one of those poles, there are questions about what you do with the waste matter you generate too.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's not a joke. The pretense of independence is the pretense that everything about my life from start to end needs nobody but me to make it happen. And, you know, the first second of my birth, when I inhale, puts the lie to that, as does the 9 months previous. So I just don't see independence as valuable in that way. Whereas I see interdependence as how we counteract authoritarianism.
And it might be that we could say that community is, you know, is where we go from, you know, the opposite end of that sort of scale. That,
I could live with that. Community, why not?
And independence is a kind of sociopathic trait. I don't need anybody. I don't care about anybody. Exactly. Solipsism, you know, you're all just figments of my imagination. And it sounds like a sort of hurt and sulking child more than an adult reflection on life, because the wonder of life is in relationship with the world and with other people. You take that away and you've got some, you know, a bleak existence sitting on top of a pole, wondering whether, like a sloth, you're going to have to go down to the ground, which is a dangerous place when you need to evacuate your insides.
So that takes us, to sectarianism, and it's exactly what we've just been talking about, this idea that we are part of something bigger than ourselves. In the sectarian model, we withdraw to only the pure. The demand for purity now becomes, since we are the pure, we mustn't mix with anybody else. So you get this nonsense like Kenneth Copeland saying that he can't use commercial airliners because he'd be in a steel tube up in the air with a bunch of demons, because nobody else is as pure as he is. So instead of being, he wants people to think he's a Christian. Good luck with that. But he wants to be this Christian who, instead of being a loving person who demonstrates the love of Christ to strangers in a plane, he wants to live in his own little isolated splendor in his own private plane, actually one of his private planes. So he doesn't have to mix with hoi polloi and be contaminated by us. What's going on there? You know, Hare Krishna person who told me that the women couldn't actually be in the same teaching meeting that he attended unless they kept silent, because their voices were not to be heard. They were distractions. They were impure. They were ritually impure. They were horrible, ignorant people. Their brain was only half the size of a man's, and therefore they were stupid. And there's on and on and on with every kind of misogyny. So even within his own group, he was withdrawing into a subgroup of what he regarded as the superior people, which of course he was, and the women weren't. I kind of have the impression that they've jettisoned a lot of that more extreme teaching now. I certainly hope so, because that was just dreadful. But
I mean, we're seeing a lot of compromises in the last 60 or 70 years relating to misogyny. So the changes that have occurred, say, in the Latter-day Saints, in the Watchtower Society, racism as well, you know, that not just white people have souls, according to some of these movements now.
Well, and the Mormons, you know, in 1968, was it, or 67? I think it was 68. They decided that black people weren't all the devil after all, you know, and they could be Mormons. But that wasn't that long ago.
No, and it's important when we're looking at the verity, how true, and the probity, how honest are these groups, that they have an absolutely rigid dogma, and then one day go, well, that's not true anymore. And it's difficult. I think it's difficult whenever, you know, a small group of people get control and can determine how other people ought to behave. And we start getting it's pretty usual that the very things they are prohibiting are the things that they're doing. That, we've all too often found that to be true. So.
But this idea of separation, this idea that in order to be, well, if you're a Scientologist, you're supposed to be able to communicate with anyone on any topic. You're supposed to have the technology to handle suppression. You're supposed to have the technology to clear the planet. You're supposed to have the technology to really basically to wipe out all the bad stuff on the planet. So how do they do that? Well, they disconnect from anybody who disagrees with them. They cut people off, they punish people, they carry out all kinds of cruelty in order to force people to conform to them, because the technology doesn't seem to work the way intended.
It's 72 years later, and it's really not happened.
Yeah.
You also have, of course, that there are two other prohibitions on communication which are very restrictive. You can't communicate with a suppressive person, somebody who's been deemed to be against life, such as myself. You're not allowed to, even though you can communicate freely with anyone else on any subject. But on any subject also becomes difficult, because you're not allowed to talk about the procedures of Scientology, which is called verbal technology, and that's prohibited. So there is subject matter you can't use. You also can't talk about your own case. Now, that is to say, you can't talk about your problems and difficulties in life. So there are things you can't say, there are people you can't talk to, but you are free to communicate freely with anyone on any subject. And those kind of double binds are commonplace not only in Scientology, but wherever we go, that we find ourselves kind of suspended, unable to make decisions, because the leader has offered both ends of the spectrum. You know, this is the right thing to do, and this is the wrong thing to do.
And you are in an altered state of consciousness at that point, because nothing nothing is cognitively making sense to you.
Yeah.
Nothing is emotionally
Straight
making
into
sense
the
to you.
state, yeah.
There's nothing moving you. Your emotions aren't moving you. Your mind isn't moving you. And how do you make a decision like that? You can't move toward what you feel. You can't move toward what makes sense. And you're stuck. And now you're just waiting to be given an order.
Yeah. Yeah. Just suspended in the amniotic fluid of the guru's gestating process.
Yeah. And that creates this, that pushes you back into authoritarianism. The leader has got to tell you. And what the leader tells you is you have to disconnect. They have to go, the people you disconnect from have to go through A&E and blah, 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 blah. And yeah, well, what, how does that match up with this idea that we can be talking to people?
Well, and we can be completely self-determined as long as we do exactly what we're told.
And that's always the ultimate.
And round it goes. For me, leaving Scientology, and that was nearly 39 years ago now, the first year that I was away from it was I just had the most incredible sense of liberty, because I realized that for 9 years I'd been having to get onto the tram lines and force my thinking.
So what, for me, the key to this sectarianism is that you create a dividing line of us and them. This is extremism, but for the group rather than for the individual. You create this us and them. And now what's important is, are you one of us or not? Or can you become one of us? So you get people in America asking, are you a Democrat or are you a Republican? Are you a Trump supporter or not? And that's actually important to them, to the point where if you give the wrong answer, you're not part of the conversation anymore. You're not welcome there. People have been thrown out of meetings that they just wanted to attend. Reporters have been thrown out that they just wanted to attend because they didn't give the right answers, or because they were seen to be from the wrong side, maybe their employer or the newspaper, and they were just, you're not one of us, you're one of them. And that creation means that at the softer end, towards the 0 point, you're just saying, well, you're not as good as we are, and you're not good enough to be one of us. But when you get further away from the 0 point, you're actually demonizing these people. They're not less, they're evil. They're literally evil. It's not just their opinions, it's them. They are constitutionally bad folk, which is what it's what we've been living with in America, at least for several years now. This idea that, well, Pence didn't do what he was told and steal the election. Therefore, Pence is a traitor.
Therefore, we should hang him.
Yeah, I mean, he's an actual traitor. He's not somebody who disagreed. He's not somebody who saw things differently. He's not one of us anymore. And
simply because he upheld the law.
Yeah.
And that kind of, I mean, it does go back in the US to the Civil War.
Yep.
The battle flag, and it is the battle flag of the Confederacy, is exhibited and has now come to take on so many meanings. The word patriot as but what they're patriots for their fellow Trump supporters, or indeed on the other side, they're patriots for other Democrats.
It's gotten very like the word cult.
Yeah, what does it mean anymore? Because it's rooted in the imagined community, the idea of a nation.
And that's exactly it. It's that imagined community that takes place here. This idea that these are the people, we separate with these people away from those people, and now we're suspicious of those people, and they have to prove themselves to cross over to us. Once you've created the divide, the us and them chasm, in order for people to come, either you do what the exclusive brethren have done and you don't let anybody join anymore, and you push people away at all costs. You let them give money, but you push them away at all costs. Or you do what most groups do, which is you make them prove that they are truly one of you now. And that's where Lifton's cult of confession comes in an unexpected way. Because first, you have got to humiliate yourself to prove that you've seen the errors of your ways and you've seen the errors of the group that you used to be part of, and you really are committed. You know, so you get this thing of unificationists banging their head on the floor to prove that they are really repenting. And of course there's the confessional in Scientology, and there are the in the SCOAN group in Nigeria, the Synagogue Church of All Nations of T.B. Joshua, the late T.B. Joshua. Everybody went through this ritual of confessing the most outlandish things against themselves, and of going through a rite of having demons cast out of them, because that's how evil they were. And subsequently, if you disagreed with T.B. Joshua at any point, you were likely to have to go through that whole thing again. And it was videotaped, and it was shown around the world, and it was put up on the internet, and so on, you know. So that cult of confession, it comes in that unexpected way, that it forces you to reaffirm that you are really a member of the group. And over against that, what I want to see, and what I see as the opposite, is tolerance in the first instance, but a kind of a graduation of tolerance and openness, and a positive openness that says not merely, well, if I have to talk to you, I'm happy to do that, but actually wants to talk to you, wants to reach out. And it's not about socializing, although that's part of it. It's about, I want to understand. I have the drive to know you. I have the drive to know the world around me, by letting the world tell me who it is and what it is, not by imposing my definition on it. And that leads to what I've called dialogue. But the whole thing for me is ensconced in this idea of what Martin Buber described as the I-thou relationship, that things are no longer merely things, and especially people are no longer merely things. That your bus driver isn't a functionary. He's a human being who's helping you to get from here to there. And all the people around you are actual people. And you can have...
Scientology, you have the shocking word terminal.
Oh, I hate that expression.
In person. When we were in Toronto in 2015, a former senior member of Scientology who'd been out for 30 years by this time, used the word terminal, and realized she'd done it as soon as, you know, because she was talking to us.
Yes.
You know, and somebody who'd been involved in helping many people leave, but still this thought of taking identity away from somebody. So you have an I-you relationship instead of an I-thou. You know, it doesn't work so well in English anymore. You know,
no, it's been lost.
French and German, you have a plural term.
Yes, but by all means, go read Martin Buber. It's good for your soul. It's good for your mind. It's good for your heart. But that use of terminal goes right along with the idea that communication is just a cycle that you finish. It's not an open-ended thing. It's a closed thing. You have to finish the cycle, close the cycle, get rid of it. You say what you got to say. You hear what you got to hear, and that's it. You're done. It's a mechanical operation. It's not a relationship at all, really, necessarily. It doesn't have to be.
And it doesn't. You don't need to have warm blood, of course. In Scientology, you have this notion of many past civilizations where meat bodies were not used, but people had dough bodies. And so this depersonalization, this taking away of unique identity from people, so that they do just become grist to the mill. They just become casualties in the war on truth. Instead of, you know, Stalin, isn't it? The death of one person is a tragedy. The death of a million is a statistic.
My only ambitions for this are that we move away from trying to label what we're seeing in these groups and move toward identifying it, seeing this thing is happening. How do I reverse this? How do I heal this? How do I, when somebody has been reduced to a cog in a machine, how do I enable them to see that they are people with worth as human beings? And how do I get them to push away this devaluing that they've experienced so that they can accept themselves for who they are and begin to enter into these real relationships with other people, not out of suspicion that, well, they really don't like me, they're just doing this as a show, but really enter into a relationship and know that they are embraced by other humans and that they can embrace other humans in this personal way and
Yeah.
rebuild their lives and reclaim their lives. And that's the first thing. The other thing is, I really do think that there's an area of study here. And all you folks that are going to be on Linda and Rod's course next year, think about this. There is a way of putting numbers to this, doing a proper analysis of these kinds of things, fleshing them out more than I've been able to do in just a couple of hours here. Talk about, you know, the way that cognitive dysfunction feeds into this. Talk about the way that Lifton and his model feeds into this, and the way other models feed into this, and see if it's a useful tool to you.